He did not want to be worshipped. That was the first thing. For roughly 38,000 years, the man known as the Emperor of Mankind had been running a single continuous operation. Not an empire, though the Imperium of Man was the instrument he had built for it. An operation. The systematic liberation of his species from everything that preyed on it. The alien civilizations at the galaxy's edge, the superstitions that kept humanity fracturable and small. And above all, the entities in the parallel dimension his galaxy swam inside. He called that dimension the warp. He called his policy the imperial truth. Its pillars were severe and simple. No gods, no superstition, science as the only honest vocabulary for reality, and humanity's unquestioned right to rule the stars it had evolved beneath. He suppressed religion with the same systematic force he applied to alien incursion. He engineered 20 Primarchs, demigod commanders built at the intersection of science and something older than science, each one a living proof that humanity needed no divine sanction to produce beings of extraordinary capacity. He knew the chaos gods were real while he told his species this. He knew it because the entities of the warp fed on collective psychic belief, and mass atheism starved them. The imperial truth was a lie deployed as medicine. The man who deployed it was both the most idealistic and the most monstrous thing in his universe simultaneously, and he had decided long ago that this was the correct position to hold. There was also the webway. An ancient alien species had built a network of corridors running between stars through a dimension the warp could not reach. His secret project, pursued in parallel to the Great Crusade and in absolute silence inside the bedrock of the Imperial Palace, was to give all of humanity access to those corridors. To reroute every ship and signal out of the warp and into the clean tunnels where the feeding could not follow. A permanent, species-scale severance from the gods he denied existed. The mechanism failed. Not through enemy cunning, but through the recursive tragedy of a man who built everything on total secrecy, and then watched his own children find the parts he had hidden from them. The project was destroyed. He was destroyed. And in the moment of that destruction, something occurred that 38,000 years of foresight had not predicted. He fell. The fracture opened above the North Atlantic at 3:14 in the morning, 40 kilometers east of the New York coastline. It did not look like a tear in space. It looked like the universe had briefly forgotten how to continue a sentence and left a gap where the next word should have been visible only by the wrongness of its absence. No light bled out of it, no sound preceded it. The only evidence it existed was what it produced in every sensitive mind within 500 kilometers. A total psychic silence, the kind that is louder than the sound it replaced. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Stephen Strange registered it first. His instruments produced readings with no entry in any text he had consulted from any dimension he had accessed. Not a multiversal signature. He knew those, had been cataloguing them for 3 years. This was from somewhere outside, that architecture entirely governed by principles he could not cross-reference against anything he had. What he could establish, the entity that came through, was psychically active at a scale where Strange ordinarily dealt with gods and abstracts. He began making calls. In Westchester, Charles Xavier lost contact with Cerebro for exactly 3.7 seconds. Not an interference pattern. Something so vast and directionally coherent that the instrument could not process it as a mind, more a beacon than a thought, more a signal than a person. He said to an empty room, "That is not what I expected." Wanda Maximoff woke from a dream she would not remember and sat up with her palms burning. He came through the fracture without urgency. A mind interrupted mid-sentence, picking up where it had left off. He descended with the slowness of something already oriented, already building the picture it would need, and he hit the Atlantic and displaced it. A column of water 200 meters tall rose above the impact site, visible from the Long Island shore and from two satellites that had been repositioned to track the anomaly. The water came down. Then he was at the surface, and standing on it, with the stillness of something that had decided gravity was a professional courtesy it was willing to extend to this planet. Dozens of feeds caught him before the military cordon was half established. The figure in the footage was immense enough that scale required a reference point. He occupied more psychic space than the island of Manhattan occupied physical space. He looked at the water. He looked at the horizon. He turned his attention to the sky above this world in the manner of a navigator who has arrived at an unfamiliar chart already calculating where on it he stands, and who does not appear to doubt that he will determine this. He gave himself 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, in parallel to the world mobilizing around him, the man who had catalogued a galaxy catalogued this one. The psychic density was extraordinary. In his own galaxy, only he and his primarchs and the most powerful psychers in 100 worlds had read as true beacons. Here, the landscape was crowded. Dozens of signatures at city scale, several at continent scale, at least 2 of a magnitude that made him slow and examine each at length before moving on. He catalogued divine energy at one of the largest signatures, structured by a source outside any dimension he had mapped, architecturally distinct from the warp in ways that were entirely new. He catalogued a chaos-adjacent psychic signature in the northeastern hemisphere, familiar in principle and wrong in texture, like a word almost recognized from a language never learned. He catalogued a gamma radiation node in a body reading simultaneously as man and weapon, the kind of dual state his own galaxy produced through catastrophic accident. He found no warp. He found no astronomicon. He found a dimension adjacent to this one that was howling with something old and patient and hungry, something that wore the shape of a god the way a lava wears a borrowed shell. And he filed it. Priority, high, action, observe. His conclusion formed in 240 seconds. This was a human world. It was alive. It was at war with things it did not fully understand. It needed organizing. The Emperor watched the helicopters come. He watched the jets banking overhead, the Coast Guard vessels repositioning below, the lights of New York City on the horizon, all of it converging on him with the recognizable quality of a world deploying the best response it currently had. He had seen cities like this before. He had watched them fail on 1,000 worlds for reasons that were always the same and never exactly the same, and he had rebuilt them. He did not move toward the city or away from it. He said, "I see you." The voice arrived in the minds of everyone within 3 kilometers, simultaneously, a fact none of them would fully process until later. The water around his feet was perfectly still. "All right, before we dive in, I have to know who's the character you want to see finally cut loose in a universe that has absolutely no business surviving them. Drop the name in the comments. Okay, let's get into this." The shore cleared in front of him before he reached it. He walked. That was the full description, and it was insufficient. The man who had catalogued this world in 4 minutes from the surface of the Atlantic moved with the economy of someone for whom urgency was a resource allocated only to problems that warranted it, and the Long Island shoreline did not qualify. He had seen worse shores. He had built infrastructure through worse. The problem was not the approach. The problem was the psychic pressure. It preceded him by 200 meters. It was the way a tide is not intentional, a natural consequence of mass moving through a medium it affects by existing. Every living thing within that radius felt it in the oldest part of their nervous system. Not a threat exactly, not a signal exactly, but a fundamental reclassification. The category at the top of the food chain had just been revised, and the revision was walking up the beach with the unhurried consistency of something that had already decided where it was going. The crowds did not run. They made way. There is a distinction between those two responses, and the distinction mattered. The cameras caught all of it. 4 news helicopters had repositioned above the impact site before the water column finished falling. They caught him from the beach, and from the coastal road, and from every phone held at full extension by people who could not look away and could not entirely explain, afterward, why they had chosen to record rather than leave. What the footage captured was the physical fact of him, the scale, the quality of light that gathered around the figure, in a way that had no identifiable source and did not behave like light from any spectrum the cameras could name, the complete absence of any emotional register in his bearing. What the footage could not capture was what people standing within 50 meters reported separately, in accounts that matched in detail without prior coordination. The sensation of being regarded by something actively deciding whether you were significant. Not whether you were dangerous, not whether you were worth harming, whether you were worth the category of attention that involved being remembered. The image was viral before the National Guard received its first mobilization order. It had reached 9 million views before the first government statement was cleared for release. At SHIELD command, 3 analysts and 1 senior officer were running every incoming data stream against every archive they had access to. The Kree records, the Asgardian files reconstructed from Mjolnir's residual energy signature. The celestial taxonomy assembled from Eternal's adjacent intelligence over 30 years of fieldwork. The Hydra archives, repurposed after the organization's fall, built on a different methodology entirely. Every database returned the same answer, null. The senior officer had been overseeing classification for 11 years and had not seen a null return in 4 of them. She looked at the incoming data for a long time. "It's not that he's off the charts," she said at last. "It's that he's reading a different chart entirely. No one offered a better framing. They logged it and kept working." In Latveria, Victor Von Doom was watching the satellite feed on a single screen in the armored room he reserved for threat assessments. He had been watching since the water column appeared on the coastal feed before dawn. He watched the figure walk ashore. He watched the crowds part without being told to. He watched the cameras catching the light with no source, and the bearing with no legible emotional content, and the cordon forming and reforming as something the figure passed through without slowing. He said nothing for a long time. He turned the feed off, a pause, the length of a long exhale. He turned it back on. In Westchester, Charles Xavier sat at Cerebro. 3 hours earlier, he had pointed the instrument's full amplification at the new presence and found not a mind, but a signal. Something so vast and directionally coherent that Cerebro could not process it as a person. It returned not a voice but a data stream, the kind of mechanical regularity a radio telescope finds in a pulsar, and what that regularity communicated was not thought but scale, not interiority but mass. He removed it now. His hands were not quite steady. "That," he said to the empty room, "is not what I expected." He sat with it for a while. Then he began making calls, starting with the one to Strange and working outward through the list of people who needed to know what Cerebro had just refused to hold. The military cordon established itself in stages, each stage the product of an institution working against a situation with no applicable protocol. Jets held at altitude, maintaining a distance their pilots understood without being ordered to. Coast Guard vessels repositioned at sea. On the beach road, ground vehicles had stopped in a line that was neither quite a barrier nor quite a welcome. The figure walking toward the city stopped. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the ships. He looked at the vehicles with the attention of something translating text in a language it has worked with before, and with the stillness of a scale that does not have to perform. When he spoke, his voice arrived in the minds of every person within 3 kilometers simultaneously, not through the air, not as a sound that waves could carry. In the minds, the way a thought is in a mind, except the thought belonged to someone else and was fully formed and had in its construction the weight of 40,000 years of deployment behind every word. I am not your enemy. I am not here for conquest. I have come through no mechanism I chose, and I intend to remain until I understand how to leave, or until I determine that remaining is more useful than departing. You will want to send your best minds, not your weapons. I have seen everything your weapons can produce, and none of it is relevant. He kept walking. The cordon did not stop him. It reformed ahead of him repeatedly, as water reforms around something moving through it, and he passed through each reformation without slowing. There was no hostility in this and no contempt. He was simply operating at a resolution where the cordon did not read as an obstacle. A portal opened at the edge of the beach road. Dr. Strange stepped through it. He was carrying an instrument the size of a compass, one he had built himself from components sourced across 4 dimensions, calibrated specifically to handle readings that his other instruments stopped being useful at. He held it toward the visitor. Already a kilometer beyond the cordon line, the needle was pinned. He knew precisely what pinned looked like on this instrument. He had held it at Dormammu's incursion threshold. He had used it during the Space Stone's full activation. It had never done this before. Not at maximum, in the sense that implied something above which readings were simply rare, but pinned in the sense that the mechanism had reached the outer boundary of what it had been designed to measure and was expressing, in the only language a mechanism has, that it had no vocabulary for what came after. Strange looked at the figure walking toward Manhattan. He looked at the needle. He put the instrument away. I'm going to need more information, he said, before he decides we don't have any. Thunder preceded him by 30 seconds. That was the announcement, not the man himself but his purpose, the Asgardian storm charge that rolled across the sky above the waterfront like a verdict already rendered, 30 seconds of atmospheric preparation for an arrival that did not require it but offered it anyway. Because Thor had learned long ago that a first impression was a resource, and that he had better ones than most. He landed between the Emperor and the city. Stormbreaker was already in his hand when he touched down the axe-blade, catching the grey morning light and releasing it as something brighter, and the full presence of him settled over the waterfront with the weight of genuine divine power. Not performed power, not the impression of it. The actual article, drawn from a source that Strange's instruments could classify because Strange had done it before, and the Odin Force had a signature, a specific frequency in the cosmic architecture of this universe that was catalogable if you knew where to look. Thor had stood before Galactus. He had survived confrontations with beings who rewrote the physical constants of the space they occupied. He stood here with the complete confidence of someone who had measured his own limits by exceeding them repeatedly, and who had not yet found a ceiling that held. From the Emperor's perspective, the classification was immediate and wrong. He performed it in real time. The way he classified every power signature he encountered, systematic, rapid, organized into the schema he had built across 38,000 years of cataloging exceptional beings. Working hypothesis, a powerful alien, genus unknown, using a technology that read as innate ability. He had encountered this before. It was almost always this. He began the scan. The scan returned something he had no entry for. What he found in Thor was not a powerful alien. It was not a psyker of extraordinary magnitude. It was not a being with a technological augmentation producing an anomalous result. What he found was divine energy, structurally organized by a source entirely outside any dimension he had ever mapped. The Odin force was not the warp. It was not a psyker's channeled force from a psychic dimension. It was not anything in his taxonomy, because the taxonomy he had built across 400 centuries had been built on a premise he had treated as axiomatic, that there were no gods, only dimensions, only the beings inside them. Only the energy systems those beings ran on. In 38,000 years of looking, he had found nothing that did not fit into that framework. The Odin force had no mechanism he could find. It drew from somewhere exterior to everything he had mapped, and the map was comprehensive. He filed it. The new entry had no existing category to go under. He created one verified divine power, external architecture. He filed it there, in the space he had just made for it, and noted that the implications were significant and would require time. He did not currently have. He continued walking. Thor interposed. "I have faced gods and world-enders," he said. "I have seen what the arrival of an unknown power without announcement usually means." He did not attack. He had faced enough genuinely dangerous things to recognize the difference between the posture of threat and the posture of assessment, and what was walking toward the city wore the latter. "Tell me who you are," Thor said, "and tell me why you came." The Emperor stopped. He looked at Thor with the unhurried quality of a being deciding how much of the accurate version of an answer to deploy. He had given versions of this speech for 30,000 years, and knew that what he said in the first 30 seconds determined whether the next conversation was short or very long. He reached into Thor instead, not with his hands, not as an attack. He extended a psychic scan of a precision and depth that Thor had no frame of reference for, that was not the Mind Stone, and was not Professor X's careful telepathic courtesy, and was not Loki's layered misdirections. It read Thor, the way an expert reads a mechanism, not his thoughts but his structure. The architecture of the Odin force. Within him, the shape of the power and the dimension it drew from, and the relationship between those two things. The scan lasted approximately 4 seconds. Thor felt it as a pressure behind his eyes, and a stillness in the air, and a quality of attention so comprehensive that it was difficult to breathe under it. Not because it took anything, but because something that thorough left no room for anything else. Then it stopped. "You are a god," the Emperor said, "not as a concession, as a finding, not a being calling itself a god. Not an alien of divine aspect whose capabilities a primitive culture categorized theologically. You are a god in the structural sense. Your power draws on a dimension that does not connect to anything I have previously mapped. The Odin force is real, architecturally distinct from every energy system in my taxonomy, and genuinely exterior to the dimensions I have spent 40,000 years classifying." "This is interesting." "Thor, you say that like it concerns you." "Emperor, I say it because I have spent 40,000 years insisting gods do not exist. I insisted this because the entities in my universe that called themselves gods were parasitic dimensions feeding on collective belief, and denying them the belief starved them. I was correct about those entities. The evidence here is revising the broader position. 4. You are telling me you denied the existence of gods because it was useful, and now you have found one you cannot explain, and you are treating this as a data point. Thor considered him for a moment with the expression of someone who has faced a great many unusual things, and is encountering a new category of unusual. You are a very strange man. Emperor, I am aware. The demonstration came next, and it was not a fight. The Emperor had no interest in fighting Thor. Fights were inefficient introductions, and Thor had done nothing to warrant being harmed. What he needed was a display of magnitude sufficient to recalibrate Thor's threat model, which was the operationally necessary outcome of this encounter. He raised a hand and moved the harbor. 3 cargo vessels, each massing between 15 and 20,000 tons, repositioned over the course of 40 seconds from their berths toward open water. Not violently, they moved at roughly the speed they would have moved under their own engines, but without engines, without wake, without any mechanism visible from the waterfront or from the Coast Guard vessels watching at a distance. He returned them when he was done. The entire sequence lasted 90 seconds, and the only evidence it had occurred was the expressions on the faces of everyone watching. Strange. Behind the cordon line looked at his instrument readings, and then at the harbor, and put the instrument away. Then the Emperor turned toward Thor and released a wave of compressed psychic presence. Thor absorbed it. He was not a being that absorbed things and fell, and he did not fall. Stormbreaker's lightning crackled along the blade with the defensive charge of something that had registered a genuine threat and responded accordingly. Thor's feet did not leave the ground. His bearing did not shift. But he took a step back, one step, the involuntary, load-bearing kind that a body takes when it has reached the edge of what its structure can hold without moving. He looked at the Emperor with an expression that had lost its quality of clinical assessment and replaced it with something that was not quite wonder, but occupied the adjacent space. I have stood before Galactus, Thor said. I did not feel that, Emperor. I am not Galactus. I am something you do not have a category for. That is fine. I intend to demonstrate what I am until the category becomes obvious. Thor, and what are you? Emperor, the thing that built the infrastructure your world does not have. I'm going to look at your world now and begin to understand why. He walked past Thor and continued toward the city. Thor watched him go with the specific quality of a man who has just been handed a problem for which his existing frameworks are insufficient, and knows it, and is already working on what comes next. After a moment, a portal opened beside him. Strange stepped through. I have fought gods, Thor said. I have fought sorcerers. I have fought the architects of reality. That is none of those things. Strange, I know. Then what is it? I don't have a word for it yet. Thor looked at the figure moving toward Manhattan with the unhurried consistency of something that had already decided the city would be there when it arrived. Then we need one, he said fast. He had chosen the place himself, which was the first thing they noticed. Not a street, not a rooftop, not a coastline position with tactical exits. A park, open ground, visible from multiple approach vectors, with lines of sight in every direction and no natural cover within 200 meters. The Emperor stood in the center of it, with his hands at his sides, and the particular stillness of a general waiting for a briefing to begin, rather than a combatant preparing for an engagement. He had stopped moving toward the city 2 hours ago, and he had stood here since, and he had made no demands and issued no instructions and done nothing that any of the surveillance systems tracking him could classify as preparation for violence. Banner was the first to name it, He said it quietly, to no one in particular. As the group assembled behind the cordon line, he called a meeting. "We're in his meeting." No one disagreed. They went in. Thor came first, Stormbreaker in hand, Strange through a portal at the group's left flank. Wanda stayed to the back of the group, which was not reluctance, but the specific tactical positioning of someone who has learned to watch from a distance until they understand the shape of the engagement. Sam Wilson came forward with Thor, not because he had the most power in the group, but because he was Captain America, and that title had never been about the power. Banner in banner form stood near the middle of the assembled group and watched the Emperor with the careful attention of a scientist examining something he had already been examined by. The Emperor looked at them. He took a moment with each face, the way a commander takes a moment with each unit in a formation, not socially but for purposes of assessment. Then he began. "You are well-resourced," he said. "You are poorly organized. You have individually exceptional assets, deployed with no coherent command hierarchy, no unified threat response doctrine, and no single psychic network capable of real-time tactical coordination. You have, by my count, at least 4 entities of extinction tier potential, operating with full autonomy and no command structure above them." He said this without accusation and without any inflection that suggested he expected them to feel defensive about it. He was filing a report. He had filed this report before on different worlds, and the worlds that had heard it and acted on it had been better positioned for what came next. "The first point," he said, "there is a being in your northeastern hemisphere with power on the order of a stellar event, housed in a fractured psyche with no containment protocol that I can detect. That is not a hero. That is an undetonated weapon someone decided to leave in a city and hope does not go off." The group was quiet. This was not a comfortable quiet. "The second point, there is a user of power in your population whose ability is tied to a dimension I classify, in my own taxonomy, as extremely hostile. That classification is provisional. The urgency is not." Wanda, at the back of the group, did not move. "The third point, there is a being of apex tier, martial, and psychic capacity. He has a philosophy I have encountered before, in different clothes. He will arrive with or without your preparation. I would suggest preparing." He paused, in the way something pauses when it has finished a list, rather than the way something pauses when it is waiting for a response. "Your world has resources. It does not know how to deploy. I do. This can be corrected." The silence held for a moment. Then Sam Wilson stepped forward. He did not step forward the way someone steps forward to argue. Sam's authority as Captain America was not a matter of volume or aggression. It was a matter of moral clarity delivered at the moment it was most needed. And this was that moment. He stopped a few meters from the Emperor and looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard a great many good arguments for bad frameworks and has learned to identify the specific place where the framework breaks. "You're talking about saving us," Sam said. "I'll give you that. But you're not talking about saving us with us. You're talking about saving us over us." The Emperor looked at him. The look was not dismissive. It was the look of a being who had heard this argument before and who had spent time with it and who still did not have a version of the counter that resolved it. "I am talking about organizing assets against a threat that will not wait for consensus," he said. "And who decides the assets? Someone must." "Yeah," Sam said. "That's always the part." A beat of quiet. The Emperor did not look away from Sam, and Sam did not look away from the Emperor, and the exchange had the quality of 2 structures measuring each other across a space. Neither was ready to cross yet, Then the emperor spoke. He did not argue the full position. That came later. What he did was name the cost of the alternative, not with cruelty and not with sentiment, but as data, the way he had always presented data, with the even precision of someone who had accumulated it for 40,000 years and had long since finished grieving the conclusions. He named the worlds he had watched fail. Not all of them. There was not time for all of them, and the number was not a number most beings could hold. He named the shape of the failure, a species that had the right to make the final decision, and insisted on it, right up until the decision was made for them by something that did not ask. He named what the bodies looked like after. He did it in 2 sentences, and then he stopped. Strange, standing at the edge of the group, said quietly to Sam, "He's not wrong, Sam. He's not right either." Strange. I know. The emperor turned his attention across the group from Strange to Thor to Banner to the assembled defenders standing in this park that was also, and had been from the moment he chose it, a briefing room. His assessment of them was visible, not the assessment that found them wanting, but the kind that found them worth assessing. It was the closest he had come, in the hours since he arrived, to something that could be called interest in a specific individual rather than a category. His gaze found Wanda last. She was standing at the back of the group, her hands at her sides, watching the exchange with the careful attention she always brought to situations where the outcome was not yet decided. The emperor looked at her. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than he had looked at anyone else, with an expression that was not identification exactly, not recognition exactly, but something between those 2 things. The look of someone who has opened a file they have seen the format of before and found unexpected content inside. Then he looked away. Wanda said nothing during the meeting. She said nothing after it, when the group dispersed and the park returned to being a park with a very large and very still figure standing in its center watching them go. She said it later to Strange when she found him cataloging the encounter in the sanctum. "He looked at me," she said. "At the end, you saw it." Strange. "I saw it." She was quiet for a moment. "He looked at me the way someone looks at a wound they've seen before." Strange did not argue with that. He wrote it down. The Avengers needed a number. That was the problem, and Banner understood it before anyone said it aloud. Thor's recalibration in the harbor had told them something. What it had told them was that Thor, standing before a psychic wave and taking a step back, was the data point they had. A being who had faced Galactus and survived found the Emperor worth stepping back from. That was meaningful. That was also the only measurement they had, and it was a measurement that said something about Thor, not about what the Emperor could do to a target that was not a god. The human heroes and the institutions behind them needed a scale they could argue with, something calibrated in units they understood, something that did not require you to know what it meant to stand before Galactus. "If he can match the Hulk," Banner said, "we need to know that now, before we make any decisions." He said it with the specific flatness of a man who has spent years having a conversation with a version of himself that he did not choose, and has made a kind of peace with the fact that this is the conversation they have to have. "I'm not volunteering out of enthusiasm. I'm volunteering because I'm the right tool for the measurement." The Emperor, who had been listening from across the room without appearing to listen, said, "That is the first operationally coherent suggestion I have heard since I arrived." They found open ground outside the city, the kind of ground that could absorb a large amount of structural consequence without also absorbing a large number of people. The Avengers established a perimeter. Strange raised a containment field that would not hold for long against what was about to happen inside it, but would hold long enough to matter. Sam held his position at altitude and watched. Wanda stayed at a distance that was close enough to act from if something went wrong and far enough to be safe if it went right. Banner looked at the Emperor standing in the center of the open ground with the patience of something that had decided to be measured and was waiting for the process to begin. Banner closed his eyes. He opened them. He let go of the part he usually held on to. The Hulk was not a thing that happened gently, and it did not happen gently here. The transformation was accompanied by a concussive wave of gamma radiation that Strange's containment field took and distributed across its surface with the practiced efficiency of a structure that had been specifically designed to receive large amounts of energy in a short period of time. Then the Hulk was standing where Banner had been standing, and the ground under him was already suffering for it, and he looked at the Emperor with the focused attention of something that had exactly one mode for interactions. The Emperor did not brace. He did not move. The Hulk's first charge covered 40 meters in a time that instruments registered and human observers experienced as an event happening before it happened. The Emperor was not where the charge arrived. He had preoccupied the position the Hulk's force would not reach, with the quality of a man reading a map he has memorized, stepping around the hazards because he knows where they are, rather than because he is fast enough to avoid them in real time. He had that kind of foresight. He had always had it, and here it was, the 38,000-year reflex of a being that could perceive the near future of an engagement the way a reader perceives the end of a sentence they are still in. The Hulk adapted. He always adapted. The second charge came at a vector the first had not, and the third from a direction that the second's momentum made structurally unexpected, and the Emperor received each of them with the economy of someone who had been doing this work for longer than most civilizations had existed. He did not fight back. He received, he redirected. He turned the Hulk's force against itself with a precision that was almost indifferent, except that it was not indifferent at all. It was fully present, fully engaged, processing the Hulk at every moment, with a clarity of attention that the Hulk, in rage-scaling mode, would not have recognized as attention, because it did not feel like anything a rage-scaled mind would categorize that way. Then the Emperor stopped redirecting, and held the Hulk's right arm at the apex of a swing, caught in a telekinetic grip and stopped. Not deflected, stopped. The exchange of forces involved was the kind that produced secondary consequences. The ground under the Emperor's feet cracked in a radius of 8 meters, each crack running outward from a central point with the signature of something that had transmitted an enormous amount of downward force into the substrate below it. The Emperor did not move. He held the arm. The Hulk pulled against the grip with the full load of his rage scaling, which was a pull that had no documented ceiling, and for 11 seconds the Emperor held the arm and the ground cracked further and did not give, and neither did the grip. This was the most physically contested the Emperor became in the story, not a casual suppression, but a genuine contest of force, the kind that required everything he had allocated to the physical dimension of the problem, which was not everything he had. He reached into Banner's mind, not the Hulk signal, not the rage itself, which was not accessible to the kind of precision this required. He reached past the rage to the specific psychological architecture underneath it, the man whose fear and shame and grief had been producing the gamma response for years, and he found the node where the response was triggered and sustained, and he turned it down. Not off permanently. Not damage. A damping, temporary and surgical, applied with the precision of something that has operated inside minds for so long that the individual components of one are legible the way an instrument panel is legible. Each gauge labeled, each function mapped. Banner transformed back in the middle of a combat zone. The Hulk, stopped being the Hulk with the abruptness of a machine losing power, and Banner was standing there in torn clothing in the middle of the open ground, breathing hard, looking at the Emperor with an expression that did not quite have a name. Not fear, not the specific shape that fear produces in the face. Something below fear, at the foundation level, the expression that happens when a thing you had not categorized as a constraint reveals itself to have been one all along. He looked at his own hands. "He didn't fight me," Banner said very quietly to anyone within range. "He turned me off. The Avengers held their positions." Thor, at the containment field's edge, was silent for a long time. He had fought beings who could rival the Hulk in direct force. He had fought beings who could defeat the Hulk through cunning. He had not seen anything that did this before. Strange's instrument, which had been pinned in the harbor during the harbor demonstration, generated a reading now. Not a power level. The mechanism had already established that it could not register a power level for this particular source. What it generated was a classification. The display read PSYKK Apex, no known tier comparison. Strange looked at it for a moment. Then he put it away again. Wanda said, he was measuring Banner's power, and then he decided Banner's power was less useful than Banner being human. Sam. And he made that choice for him, without asking. The Emperor. Asking would have taken longer, and the Hulk was not in a position to answer. Sam looked at him. "That's not the part I was objecting to." A junior SHIELD analyst, reported via CAM from the observation station at the field's edge, confirmed psychic intervention into a gamma-enhanced subject. No neurological damage detected. Full reversion in 11 seconds. No prior recorded analog in any database. Banner was sitting on a piece of broken ground. He heard the report. He repeated the last 4 words in the voice of someone finding them inadequate. No prior recorded analog. He looked at his hands for a long time. He did not sound relieved. He sounded like a man who has just learned something about the ceiling of the room he lives in, and the new information is that the ceiling is closer than he thought, and that someone he has not decided to trust, yet knows exactly where it is. Xavier reached out first, and the reaching out was itself a statement. He did it through Cerebro, from Westchester. At the most careful level, his telepathy could manage. A knock rather than an intrusion. The psychic equivalent of standing outside a closed door and making one's presence known rather than opening it. He had done this before. He had done it with every major psychic entity he had encountered across decades of work, and the approach was always the same. The courtesy of notification, the recognition that another mind had the right to decide whether it wanted to be entered. He had done it with the Phoenix Force, which was less a mind and more a cosmological event that sometimes wore one. He did it now with an entity whose presence he had been feeling for 2 days as a massive, coherent, directionally stable signal in the corner of every psychic awareness he possessed. The Emperor opened the channel without hesitation, not as a courtesy. The door simply opened with the quality of a door opened by someone who had been aware of the knock, approximately 4 seconds before it occurred. What Xavier found inside was not what he had prepared for. He had prepared, on the walk from his chair to Cerebro, for something alien. Something vast in the way that alien vastness was vast, inhuman at the root, organized by principles outside human architecture, the way the Phoenix Force was organized by principles outside human architecture. He had prepared himself to read a mind that was powerful, but fundamentally other. What he found was not other. It was human. Specifically, recognizably, profoundly human. This was the most disturbing thing about it. because a human mind of this age and scale was something no human mind should have been able to produce, and the dissonance between the familiar substrate and the incomprehensible scope of what had been built on top of it, alien architecture at least, you could hold at a distance. This you could not. This was recognizable, this was just human, and it had been running for 38,000 years. Xavier read what was there and tried to stay oriented. He read the grief first because it was loudest, genuine, vast, not performed and not suppressed, the accumulated weight of a being who had loved a species across 40 millennia, of watching it fail and watching it survive and watching it fail again. Who had spent those millennia trying to build something that would outlast the failing, and had watched that fail too? The grief was old enough that it had stopped having specific objects. It was not grief for anyone. It was grief as a condition, the way water is a condition of a thing that has been submerged for long enough that it has stopped being wet and has started being water. Xavier had worked with grieving minds before. He had never worked with anything that grieved at this scale and had simply continued working. He read the calculation next, and it was cold in a way that was not cruelty. Cold as a tool is cold because warmth would reduce its precision. It never stopped. It was running in the background of every other mental process, like a system the mind had forgotten was separate from itself, processing every incoming observation into a tactical schema that had been refined across more iterations than Xavier had years of life. He read, inside the calculation, the places where it had arrived at conclusions that were correct and morally unbearable simultaneously, and had proceeded anyway because the alternative the calculation produced was worse. He read the love for humanity. This was the most complicated thing he found, because it was genuine and it was enormous, and it coexisted completely, without friction, with total indifference to any individual human. The Emperor loved humanity the way a conservationist loves a species, at the level of the category, with the patient, comprehensive, grief-inflected devotion of a being whose objective function was the category's survival, for whom the individual was always a unit in service of the category. Xavier had known beings who claimed to love humanity and meant something narrow by it. This was not narrow. It was wider than anything he had encountered, and it had no room in it, at any width, for a specific face. He read the imperial truth and understood it, not as a lie exactly, but as the decision of a man who had calculated that the truth was more dangerous than the lie, and had been right by the only metric he was using, and had paid for it in the only currency available to someone who lives long enough to see what they built become what they fought. He read the Webway project, and the shape of it stopped him. A being who tried to sever an entire species from the dimensions that fed on it, who came within one mistake of completing the work. Whose mistake was not his own, but whose design created the conditions that made the mistake possible, because the design required absolute secrecy, and absolute secrecy made collaboration impossible. Xavier surfaced from the contact and sat in silence for a long time. He told no one what he found in detail. When someone asked later, he said, "Only he loves us, the way a shepherd loves the flock. And no sheep has ever asked a shepherd what it is like to be sheep." He came in person the next morning, by wheelchair, alone, without the X-Men as an escort. The absence of escort was a deliberate signal, and the Emperor, who was standing in the park that had become his default position, received it with a formality that was close to what you would call respect, if he were not also aware that what it most resembled was the courtesy one very old and powerful thing, before they begin to speak. Xavier said, "You spent 40,000 years telling your species there are no gods, and you genuinely believed it. Emperor, I believed it because the alternative was telling them the truth. And telling them the truth would have empowered the things I was trying to contain. The entities in the dimension adjacent to my universe fed on belief. Mass atheism starved them. That was the arithmetic. Xavier, you didn't trust your own people with the truth about what was hunting them. Emperor, no, Xavier. And you're surprised at what happened. The Emperor said nothing for a long moment. It was the closest he came, across all the hours and exchanges of his time in this universe, to the moment before shame, not shame itself. The room adjacent to it. The room where a being stands before it, either steps through or chooses not to. He did not step through, but he stood there longer than he usually stood in any room. Xavier raised the mutant question because it would not wait. He knew the Emperor had already identified the mutant population as a distinct psychic variable. He asked what the Emperor intended. Regimentation, the Emperor said. Every significant power mapped, classified. Each individual assigned a role commensurate with their capacity. A command structure. Integration into a coherent response architecture. He said this without apology and without any inflection that suggested it was negotiable. The alternative is what you currently have. Exceptional individuals operating against a landscape of threats that would require the full coordinated output of your entire exceptional individual population to address, operating instead in small groups. Xavier, you want to draft my students, Emperor. I want to deploy the single largest concentrated pool of exceptional human potential on this planet in an organized manner, rather than leaving it to operate unsupervised against threats it is not equipped to face collectively. Xavier, they are people, not assets. Emperor, they are people who are also assets. The distinction is not a binary. Xavier looked at him for a long time with an expression that was not anger and was not despair, but occupied the space between them where something being recognized lives before it becomes either. I have spent my life arguing, he said at last, against the version of that sentence that ends with, and therefore the second half matters more, Emperor. It does not matter more. The second half is simply more durable. People are mortal. Potential, organized, is not. Xavier left without resolving it. There was nothing to resolve yet. The Emperor watched him go from the center of the park with the patience of someone waiting for a conversation to happen again. Strange, who had been present and silent for the last 10 minutes, said, he believes in the dream. Emperor, yes, Strange, you don't believe in dreams. The Emperor was quiet for a moment. I believe in what they cost. Magneto did not act impulsively. That was the first thing Strange would say. Afterward, when the debrief happened, and someone suggested the word tantrum, and Strange corrected them. He had watched, he had read Xavier's account of the meeting. He had reviewed the footage from the harbor and the park and the field outside the city. He had taken 2 days to arrive at a decision that most beings in his position would have reached in 2 minutes. And the delay was not uncertainty. It was the specific patience of a man who has learned to make very sure before he acts, because the last time he acted without making sure, a great many people were harmed, and before that, the time he failed to act, 6 million people died, and between those 2 data points, he had built a philosophy of violence as language. Specific considered, deployed when the message cannot be delivered by other means. He had read the Emperor's proposal through Xavier. He knew what regimentation meant. He knew what conscription without negotiation meant. He had lived through the version of this sentence that ended with, "for your own protection," and before it ended, it had passed through stages, each stage with its own bureaucratic language, each language designed to make the next stage sound like the logical conclusion of the previous one. A man arrives with overwhelming power and a detailed plan for what to do with people like Eric Lenscher and his kind. He has heard this before. His attack was not a tantrum, it was a sentence. 40 seconds of preparation from 3 kilometers away, every ferrous object in the operational radius magnetized to his schema. The structural reinforcement of 7 buildings, the cable infrastructure of a metropolitan grid, the accumulated iron content of a borough's worth of underground transit. It was an extraordinary amount of material, and he deployed it with the precision of someone who has had 4 decades to develop an aesthetic. He did not aim it to kill, he aimed it to communicate. The Emperor looked at the incoming material and was not surprised. He received it with his telekinesis, meeting Magneto's magnetic schema, with a counterforce that organized the incoming debris into a held pattern rather than a stopped one, the difference between a wall and a fist, and for a moment the 2 structures stood against each other in the air above the park. Magneto's assembled force pressing in, the Emperor's assembled resistance pressing back, neither yielding. This was not a casual inconvenience for the Emperor. Magneto's power was Omega level, and the word was not meaningless. It meant the ceiling was theoretical, that the force available to his magnetism scaled with his intention and the available mass, and the available mass in a metropolitan area was not small. The Emperor was working. They held it for approximately 40 seconds. The scale of what was happening was not visible to most instruments. It was visible to strangers' instruments and to Wanda, who had arrived at the park's edge and was watching with her hands very still at her sides, and to Thor, who had arrived at altitude and was watching with the specific attention of a being who has fought at this level and knows what 40 seconds at maximum output costs. The Emperor's feet did not move. The Emperor did not brace visibly, but the ground around him was cracking again, each crack propagating outward in a radius that widened as the seconds accumulated, the substrate below transmitting the forces passing through it in the only way a substrate can. Then the Emperor found the edge, not by overpowering Magneto, by doing to Magneto's electromagnetic control what he had done to Banner's gamma response, reaching into the psychic architecture that interfaced between Magneto's will and his power, the specific place where intention became magnetism, and introducing a disruption. Not damage. A stutter. The kind of interruption that a complex system produces when one of its control loops receives an unexpected input and spends 1 second trying to reconcile it before resuming normal operation. 1 second was sufficient. The material held in the air above the park redistributed itself under gravity and the Emperor's telekinesis simultaneously, and the forces pressing against each other resolved, and Magneto dropped to 1 knee. He got up. The Emperor watched him get up and allowed it. This was a visible choice. He did not press the moment. He stood and waited, with the quality of something that has made its point and is now waiting for the person who received it to process it. "You held that longer than anyone I expected to meet here," the Emperor said. The statement was not warm, but in the Emperor's register it carried genuine weight. He did not say things he did not mean, and he had not expected to work at that level for that duration against anything on this planet. Your power is structured differently from the others. You reach for external force, rather than projecting from internal reserves. It creates a different architecture, more sustainable under sustained assault. Magneto, breathing, standing, with the stillness of a man who is not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him recover. "I'm not interested in your assessment, Emperor." "No, but I am interested in yours." He made the offer. He laid it out plainly, in the way he laid everything out, without softening and without misdirection and without any of the rhetorical framing that would have made it easier to receive and easier to refuse. A command role. Not as a peer, the emperor did not construct hierarchies with peers, because he had spent 38,000 years concluding that peer structures produced the kind of consensus process that did not survive contact with an existential threat. But a commander, a genuine one, with autonomy over the mutant population's integration into the response architecture, with authority over the deployment of every significant power in his purview, with the backing of a force that could not be legislated against or sentinel manufactured away. For perhaps the first time in his life, Eric Lenscher would have the backing of a power that was genuinely non-negotiable. He laid this out. Magneto listened to all of it. "I have seen men like you," Magneto said. He said it quietly and without heat, which was worse than volume would have been. They arrived with a plan that was also better than the alternative. They called it order, too. They had a hierarchy, too. They promised that the ones who cooperated would be protected. They said "your people" in a tone that implied they had considered the question and reached a generous conclusion. "Emperor, I am not offering protection. I am offering utility." Magneto. That is exactly what they said. The Emperor was silent for a moment. "The difference," he said at last, "is that I will not lose." Magneto looked at him. His expression was not contempt. It was something older and harder than contempt, the expression of a man who has survived things that were supposed to be temporary and found, on the far side of them, that the survivors are the ones who understood what permanence costs. "You already have," he said. "You just haven't noticed yet." He left. The Emperor stood in the park center and watched him go, and the stillness he held while watching was not the stillness of someone who had dismissed what was just said. Strange, watching from the park's perimeter, spoke quietly into his comm. "Magneto just told the most powerful psychic I've ever measured that his project already failed, and it just hasn't registered." And the Emperor stood there and filed it as data cap. On the other end of the line, what does that mean? Strange. It means either Magneto is wrong, or it means the Emperor has been failing for 40,000 years, and we're just the latest experiment. The line was quiet. "That's not a reassuring distinction," Cap said, finally. Strange watched the Emperor standing in the park, motionless, looking at the direction Magneto had gone. "No," Strange said, "it isn't." Strange had a question, and it was the kind of question that did not improve with waiting. He had been patient. He had catalogued and observed and held back the instinct to intervene at every inflection point where intervention had been available, because the question that was forming required the right moment and the right setting and the full context of everything that had preceded it. The harbor, the park, the field, the conversation with Xavier, Magneto on one knee in the rubble of his own assault. Strange had watched all of it, and what the watching had produced was not a threat assessment and not a tactical conclusion but a philosophical one, a point at which the evidence in this universe directly refuted the foundational premise of the being who was now standing in it. He brought the Emperor to the Sanctum Sanctorum, not because the Emperor could not refuse, the Emperor could refuse anything, but because the Emperor was curious about the mystic taxonomy, in the way that a being who has spent 40,000 years mapping one cosmological architecture becomes curious about a different one, and the curiosity was operational rather than social. He wanted the information, and Strange had it. Strange demonstrated the mystic arts, not as a threat display, as evidence. The mirror dimension, first, folded space in which the geometry of the physical world continued to operate, but was subject to rules of arrangement that the physical world did not observe. Walls folding into floors and planes rotating through angles that did not exist in the standard spatial vocabulary. The emperor moved through it with the careful attention of a navigator reading an unfamiliar instrument, mapping the rules as they presented themselves. "This is real," he said. "It was not a question. This functions independently of any psychic projection. Strange. Yes, Emperor, show me more." Strange showed him the borders of the dark dimension. Not an entry, not an incursion, but the edge, visible through a carefully contained aperture that Strange had opened and closed faster than a blink. Sufficient for a being with the Emperor's perceptual processing speed to read the full signature of what lived on the other side. The Emperor studied what he saw for approximately 3 seconds. Then Strange closed the aperture. "What you call daemons," Strange said, "we call Dormammu's servants. What you call the warp, we call the interface between physical reality and the mystic dimensions. The same phenomenon, described by 2 different taxonomies that evolved in different cosmological contexts. Emperor, the architecture is different. What you showed me does not feed on belief, the way my entities feed on belief. The dependency structure is distinct. Strange. The difference is semantic. You are both describing dimensions with hostile governing intelligences that threaten physical reality. Emperor, the difference is whether you survive the distinction. In my universe, mass atheism starved the entities. Denying them the belief reduced their power. In your universe, Dormammu is not diminished by disbelief. He exists independently of whether anyone in physical reality acknowledges him. The architecture is different. The difference is not semantic." Strange was quiet for a moment. He had prepared a longer argument. "The mystic dimensions prove your universe model is incomplete," he said at last. "You built your entire policy on the assertion that there are no gods. In this universe, gods are empirical. You denied the supernatural. In this universe, the supernatural is infrastructure. Your imperial truth is not metaphorically false here. It is false by direct evidence. Emperor, my imperial truth was not a claim about all possible universes. It was a strategy for managing mine. It was true in mine, or true enough to function, which in my experience is the only category of truth that matters for policy purposes. The strategy was, if they do not believe in the gods cannot feed on their belief. The gods in your universe do not feed on belief in the same way. Strange. No, they feed on other things. Emperor, then your problem is different from mine, but the shape of it is the same. I think you're right, he said finally, and I'm not sure whether that's comforting or terrifying, Emperor. In my experience, the answer to that question is determined by how much time you have to prepare. He felt it while they were still talking. A psychic signature at the edge of the system, distant enough that the lag between its real-time position and his perception of it was measurable, close enough to becoming. He mapped it without interrupting the conversation, the signature of a being of substantial individual power with a coherent philosophical framework, operating at civilizational scale, currently organizing material resources toward an objective. He knew this type, not this specific signature. The type, the kind of being that arrives not out of rage or appetite or territorial reflex, but out of conviction. He had encountered conviction-class threats before. They were the most expensive to address and the only ones worth the address. There is something approaching this system, he said, something that has a plan, not just power. A plan that it believes in, that is the more dangerous category. Strange did not hesitate. Thanos, you know it. We've met, Emperor. Tell me what he wants, Strange told him. The full account of Thanos' philosophy, the logic of Titan's death, the balance argument, the snap, the grief that drove it, and the certainty that the grief had revealed rather than produced. Strange did not editorialize. He had told this account before and had learned that the facts carried their own weight. The Emperor listened to all of it without interruption. His expression during the account was unreadable except at the end, when something shifted in it, not surprise, and not recognition of a new thing, but the recognition of a type so precisely familiar. "I see," the Emperor said. He watched his home world die of excess and concluded that the solution to excess is half. That is not philosophy. That is grief wearing the costume of an idea. Strange, he believes it, Emperor, yes. That is exactly the problem. A being who acts from appetite can be redirected. A being who acts from grief-turned conviction cannot be argued with in most circumstances. There is no third option at that level of sincere investment. He turned from the window of the sanctum, where he had been standing during Strange's account, and looked at the room. The quality of his attention had shifted. Still the same stillness, still the same comprehensive presence, but directed now at something internal, a decision being reached with the finality of something. "Assemble whoever is capable of operating at the relevant scale," he said. "Your strongest, not your fastest or your best loved. Your strongest, Strange. And what are you going to do, Emperor? Prepare the argument. Strange, for who?" "For him," the Emperor said, "and for what comes after we stop him." Strange was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What comes after?" Not a question. The Emperor looked at him. Yes. The planet felt Thanos' approach before he arrived. Not as a threat signal from any institutional detection system, though those registered it too. As a psychic event, a pressure change in the local portion of the system's energy field, the kind that a planet with the psychic density of this one produced when something of significant mass and intention entered the neighborhood. The Emperor had felt it coming for 16 hours. He had said nothing about the timeline beyond his initial alert, because the timeline was less important than the positioning, and he had spent the last 16 hours managing the positioning. He was already in place when Thanos arrived. The space he had chosen was a cleared area outside the city's perimeter, large enough to absorb significant structural consequence, clear enough that the people of the city were not in the immediate operational envelope of what was about to happen. The Avengers deployed around and behind him, not at his command and not because they had submitted to his authority. Because Strange had made the assessment and Cap had made the call, and it was the only arrangement that made any sense, given what was coming. They held their positions. They waited. He landed with the deliberateness of a being that does not need to announce itself, and he looked at the assembled defenders with the calm of something that has done this before and has its own taxonomy of threat that it applies automatically and efficiently. He looked at Thor. He looked at Strange. He looked at Wanda, which produced a slight recalculation. The chaos magic signature was more pronounced in person than at a distance, and more complicated. He looked at Sam Wilson, holding his position in the air at 30 meters. He looked at the whole assembled arrangement with the patience of a being that has measured every component and is now performing the final calculation. Then he looked at the Emperor. He stopped. What he found when he looked at the Emperor was not in any category he had been using for threat classification. He had a good system, refined across a very long life, organized by clear domains. He applied it and it ran, producing an output, human. He checked it, human baseline, exceptional, but human. He ran it again, human. Then he turned to the psychic dimension, and the output stopped behaving like a system and started behaving like a mechanism trying to measure something outside its range. "You're not from this universe," Thanos said. He said it not as an accusation, but as an observation, because he was a being who valued accuracy. "Emperor, no, Thanos. You came through a dimensional fracture from somewhere else entirely. Thanos, and you have already decided to stop me. Emperor, I decided that before you entered this system, I was waiting to understand whether you were worth the conversation first. Thanos and Emperor, marginally." Thanos looked at him for a long moment. The expression was not offense. It was the expression of something that has just been handed a problem it finds genuinely interesting, which in Thanos' experience is the rarest and most dangerous kind. "Then let us have the conversation," he said. The Avengers held their positions. The narrator was the distance between the two figures and the quality of the silence around them. Thanos spoke first, in the voice of someone who has arrived through long experience of stating it, at the most precise version of what they believe is true. He had watched Titan die of overconsumption. No one had listened. Titan had died the way he calculated it would die, and in the death he found the proof, and the proof became the mandate. He was not asking for sympathy. He was presenting a framework. Life is finite, appetite is not. The only equilibrium is balance. Balance requires reduction. He had performed the reduction and carried the grief of it because it was right that someone should, and he was not finished. The Emperor listened to all of it. He listened with the attention of a being who is also, in his own way, sincere, which is the only kind of attention worth having when someone sincere is speaking. "You watch your homeworld die of overconsumption," the Emperor said, "and you conclude the problem is quantity. You are correct that the problem is quantity. You are wrong about which quantity to reduce, Thanos." Emperor, capacity, not body's structure. The ability of the species to manage its own survival rather than requiring an external force to balance it every few generations. Your solution treats the species as a passive. My solution treats it as an active one. Those are not the same problem. Thanos, you have built that structure. You called it the Imperium, and from what your own testimony implies, it is failing. Emperor, it is failing. That is different from a thing that has failed. A structure that is failing can be rebuilt. A species that has been halved can also rebuild, you would say, but the halving does not contribute to its capacity to manage its own survival. The halving contributes only to the delay. In 40 years, in 400, the half that remains will fill the other half, and someone will have to do it again. Thanos. Then someone will, Emperor, or the species learns to do it itself. That is the only answer that compounds. Every other answer requires your perpetual presence as an external corrective, which means your answer has no mechanism that works in your absence, and you will be absent. Every being that is not a concept eventually dies. Thanos, you are telling me to endure. Emperor, I am telling you that your solution does not survive you, which means your solution is not a solution. A meaningful gesture made by a being who genuinely believes in it, at a scale that costs everything it costs, but a gesture, not a structure. The silence after that had a different quality from the silence before it. You believe in the species? Thanos said. Not a challenge. An observation, the way his earlier observation had been, trying to map what he was dealing with. Emperor, I believe in the species above everything else. Above the pantheon, above the cosmic architecture of any given universe, above the idea of a single just mind making the correct decision on behalf of everyone below it. He paused. Including my own. No one at the perimeter had heard him say that before. He had named the species above the individual, above the gods. He had never named it above himself. The sentence sat in the air, with the weight of something that had been true for a very long time and had just been said for the first time. Thanos registered it. You believe that, he said. And you still built an empire, Emperor. Yes, Thanos. Then we are the same Emperor. No, you kill the half you cannot save and call it mercy. I spend the half I cannot save to build the structure that protects the rest. The mathematics are similar. The direction is not the same. Thanos, the people who died, call it the same thing. Emperor, the people who lived, do not. Thanos, and if the structure fails, then I rebuild it, the Emperor said. He said it with the flatness of something that has said it before, many times, about many things, to many beings who found the answer insufficient, and who were right that it was insufficient, and who were wrong about what that meant. I have been rebuilding it for 40,000 years. I will rebuild it for 40,000 more, if that is what it takes. Thanos looked at him. Something moved in his expression below the anger, the recognition that the Emperor's position, if correct, made his project not just wrong, but unnecessary. Titan had not required a prophet, it had required a structure. And if that was true, the grief that had organized his entire life did not prove the mandate. It just proved he was in pain. He could not accept that. He made his decision, he attacked. The first exchange of direct force covered the space between them before most of the assembled observers had fully processed that it was happening. The Emperor received it. The ground under his feet transmitted the force downward and outward in a radius of 20 meters, each crack in the substrate propagating at speed, and the Emperor did not move backward. He moved the ground and stayed. Strange at the perimeter, said quietly to Sam. Stay back. If he needs us, he'll need us against Thanos, not to dig him out of the crater cap. And if he doesn't, Strange looked at the two figures already trading the second exchange. Then, God help whatever he decides to do next. The fight was not what the observers expected. That was the first thing any of them would say afterward, when the accounts were collected and compared and found to match in almost every particular, except the emotional register, which varied by individual. What the fight looked like was not what it felt like, and the three things would take a long time to be fully separated. What it looked like was two beings of extraordinary capacity exchanging force at a scale that required a significant operational buffer. Thanos' output was the output of something that had beaten the Hulk unarmed. The Emperor's physical form received it with the readiness of someone who had already read the next three exchanges and was working backward from the third to the first. The precognition was total. Thanos adapted, and the adaptations came faster and more creatively as the exchange continued, because he was a being of extraordinary tactical intelligence, and he was not fighting someone who could be worn down by variation. He was fighting someone who treated variation as additional data. The ground between them was an ongoing catastrophe. Infrastructure within the operational radius was experiencing consequences that would require months of repair. The city behind the buffer was watching on screens equal. In real time, and the silence in the streets around those screens was the silence of a population holding its breath. the Avengers held their positions. They held them because Strange had made the call, and because the call was correct. The Emperor did not need them yet, and yet was the operative word that Strange kept in the front of his attention, because what it meant was that there would come a moment when he did, and that moment would require all of them to move, simultaneously, and with everything they had. Then the fight changed. Thanos landed a strike that connected at full force, without the Emperor in a position to redirect it, because the exchange had reached a cadence, and Thanos had identified the pattern and broken it, and the Emperor received the full weight of it. The ground under him transmitted the force in a circle that was larger than any previous circle, by a factor that Strange measured on his instrument, and then looked at twice. The Emperor did not fall. He also did not move. He was in the position the strike had found him in, which was standing, and he remained in it, and the expression on his face during the approximately 2 seconds it took for him to process what he had just received was the expression of something that has been hit by something that genuinely required processing. He walked into Thanos' mind. Not as an attack. He walked into Thanos' mental architecture, the way something walks into a room. It has more right to than the furniture patient, 38,000 years deep in this kind of operation. Thanos had defenses. He had faced telepaths, had faced the Mind Stone, had spent a career hardening a mind worth protecting. The defenses were real and substantial. They were organized against intrusion. They were not organized against examination. The Emperor did not try to intrude. He did not reach for Thanos' will or his motor function, or the command systems that would have forced compliance. He reached for the architecture of Thanos' conviction, the specific place where Titan's death lived, in the structure of his certainty, the load-bearing belief that the grief had revealed a truth rather than produced a framework. He held it up to the light. He did not alter it. He did not damage it. He showed Thanos, with the precision of a being that had watched civilizations manage themselves into extinction across 400 centuries, every version of what came after. Every world that found the correct number and discovered the number was 0. Every species that balanced itself into a silence that no one remained to call a solution. He showed Thanos that his logic completed, and that it completed in a direction that was not balance. Thanos took the psychic strike and staggered. For a moment that Strange would later describe as lasting 3 seconds and feeling longer, Thanos looked like something was being removed from him. Not his power. Something in the organization of his certainty. Then he drove it out with sheer force of will, and the driving out was visible. A physical reorientation, a gathering, a decision made at the deepest level of something that has chosen to remain what it is. He retreated, not fleeing. The distinction mattered, and Thanos was the kind of being for whom the distinction would always matter. He withdrew with the quality of something that had encountered a variable, requiring reassessment before the next engagement. Not broken, not convinced. Recalibrating. He left the operational zone at speed, and the departure had in it the specific ominousness of a threat that had not been resolved, but had been postponed, and would return with additional preparation, and was the kind of being that additional preparation improved. Strange said Avengers, 1 word, and they moved. Thor's Stormbreaker cut an arc through the space Thanos was crossing, not in time to intercept, but in time to demonstrate that the cost of return would not be lower. Strange's dimensional constructs closed behind Thanos like a sequence of doors. Wanda's probability field pressed the vectors available to him into a narrower and narrower corridor, until the corridor was one. Away from the city, away from the operational zone, away from the assembled defense. Cap held his position. His job was not this fight. He knew it. He watched with the attention of someone cataloging what had just happened for the conversation that was going to follow it. The city was not destroyed. The title promise was paid. The Emperor stood in the cleared ground of the operational zone and watched Thanos go. The stillness around him was the same stillness he had arrived with 3 days ago, standing on the Atlantic. The scale of what had just occurred left no obvious mark on it. He was the same figure, in the same bearing, with the same quality of comprehensive attention directed at the retreating shape of a threat that had been stopped and not ended. Sam Wilson walked to him. Not running. Walking. With the weight of someone who has been holding a specific conversation in reserve for 3 days, and has just found the right moment, even though it did not feel like it. He stopped at a distance closer than tactical. He looked at the Emperor. "What you did," Sam said. "You saved us, Emperor." "Yes, and I don't think you know what that costs," Sam said, "or what it means." Emperor. "I know precisely what it costs. I have been paying it for 40,000 years. That's not what I mean." Sam looked at him with the expression that was the specific quality of his authority as Captain America. Not power, not size, but the willingness to say the true thing in the moment when the true thing was hardest to say. "You saved the lives in front of you, but you'd spend 1 billion others without asking. You'd spend us." He held the Emperor's gaze. "You'd spend me, Emperor." "Yes, then you are what you fight." The silence that followed was not like the silences the Emperor usually produced. Those were informational, a being processing and deciding. This one was different. Something was being acknowledged that had been true for a very long time and never spoken aloud, and the speaking of it changed not the truth, but the relationship to it, which is sometimes the more significant change. He stood in it for a long time. "I am what the threat requires," he said at last. "The threat has always required this. In my experience, it always will, Sam. Then maybe the question is whether we want to survive the way you survived, or whether we want to survive differently. Emperor, that question is a luxury the threat does not grant." Sam. "Yeah, you keep saying that, and you keep being here alone." The Emperor looked at Sam Wilson for a moment longer than any previous exchange had required. It was the look of a being encountering an argument it had not defeated and would not defeat. In 40,000 years he had always been able to defeat the arguments or outlast them or render them academic. This argument was not academic, it was standing in front of him. He looked away. "For now," he said, "not an answer. Not a concession. The closest thing to either he had said in 40,000 years, and he said it quietly, into the space where Sam Wilson's point was still sitting, unrebuted and unresolved, which was the only place it had ever fit. He did not conquer, the decision was not mercy, and it was not principle, it was arithmetic. He had assessed Earth's defenders with the same methodology he would apply to any world under consideration for integration into a larger structure. Threat profile of existing powers, organizational capacity of the defensive architecture, psychic density of the population, nature of the cosmic entities backing the framework of the reality. His conclusion on each measure was the same. The psychic density of this world's defenders was too high. The organizational capacity of its meta-human population was too responsive, not efficient, not unified, but responsive, capable of producing an effective combined output at the moment it was most needed, as the last 6 hours had demonstrated. The cosmic entities backing this reality's framework were not the kind that could be commanded or circumvented or starved of their power base. He had no warp leverage here. He had no astronomicon to project. The infrastructure he would need to stage a conquest did not exist, and he was, for the first time in 38,000 years, alone. The arithmetic said, remaining was more useful than conquering. Conquering was not available anyway. He had work to do. He did not say any of this. He did not say the other part either, the part that the arithmetic did not produce, but that sat in the negative space of his calculation like a weight the calculation had not been designed to measure. The part that was he had reached into Banner's mind to locate the gamma response, and he had found Banner. Not the Hulk's rage, Banner. The specific man who had decided to offer himself as a measurement because it was the operationally correct thing to do even though it cost him something, and who had sat on a piece of broken ground afterward and looked at his own hands. He had not found infrastructure. He had found a person who had made a choice, and the distinction was the distinction that Xavier had named and that he had not been able to answer. He had read Xavier's telepathic reach across an entire planet, driven by nothing except the belief that the gifted and the ordinary could share it. He had read it, and he had called it naive, and he had believed that, and he also had recognized it. He had tried to build something like it. It had been called the Imperium, and it had been many things, and among those things in its first centuries, before the weight of its own scale and the corruption of the things it fought began to transform it, it had been something recognizable to what Xavier was doing. He did not say this. He filed it in the same category as the Odin Force, verified, external architecture, no prior analog. He had work to do. Wanda found him at the edge of a building's roof, late in the afternoon, when the city had resumed the specific hum of a city that has survived something and is conducting a rapid internal inventory of what it still has. She came alone. He did not turn at her. Approach, which meant he had known she was coming before she arrived, which she had expected. He said, "The power you use, I know its shape." She stopped. "I've been told that before." "In my universe," he said, "I have spent 30,000 years fighting the entities your power is connected to. Not the same entities. The architecture is different, and the specific feeding mechanism is different, and the dimension your power draws from is not the warp in any technical sense." He looked at the city below. A dimension that is alive and hungry and willing to give a gifted mind everything it wants in exchange for the door it opens. Wanda, I know what my power costs, Emperor. You know what it has cost so far. He let that sit in the space between them. It was not an accusation. It was a distinction. In his experience, beings who had been given access to the power of dimensions that fed on the lives connected to them always knew what it had cost so far, and always did not know what it was still going to cost, and the knowing so far was the thing the dimension used to create the confidence that kept the door from being examined too carefully. "I am not threatening you," he said. "I am not here to take the power from you, or contain you, or add you to the list of assets requiring regulation. I am telling you that, in my experience, the door opens by degrees. The first degree feels like mastery. The second degree feels like a larger mastery. The last degree also feels like mastery, until the moment it does not, and at that point, the door is fully open, and what it was waiting to become has become it. Wanda, are you afraid of it?" He turned to look at her then. "I'm afraid of what it will eventually do to you." She had been looked at with fear before, and with awe, and with the specific distancing horror that people produce when they have seen what she can do and cannot decide whether to be grateful or terrified. She had been looked at with hatred, and with the grief that hatred wears when it is also love, and with the specific combination of both that made her particular history, her particular history. She had rarely been looked at with this, the unperformed, specific concern of a being who has watched the shape of something she contains do what it does, invariant after variant, across a very long experience, and is saying so not because it is kind, but because it is accurate, and accuracy is the only courtesy he knows how to offer. She said thank you. He nodded. He left. He occupied no formal position after that. Not an avenger, because he had never agreed to the framework that made that word mean what it meant. Not an enemy, because nothing in his assessment of this world's threat architecture made antagonizing its defenders operationally sensible. Not a conqueror, because the arithmetic did not support it, and because the arithmetic was not the only measure, and he was working on what the other measures were, without naming them yet. He was simply present. In the space between the world's defenders and its threats, which was a space no one had formally defined, and no one needed to formally define, because the space existed whether it was named or not, and he was the kind of being the space had been empty for. Strange formalized nothing. Cap accepted nothing. Magneto refused nothing that had been offered. The Emperor asked for nothing. The city went back to being a city. He was standing on a roof near the park when Peter Parker landed beside him, moving with the easy confidence of a body that has completely accepted the modification that allows it to do what it does. He stopped when he saw the Emperor. He knew who this was. Everyone did, now. He looked at the Emperor for a moment with the expression of someone who wants to say something and is not certain it has the right shape yet. "You saved everyone today," Peter said, Emperor. "Yes." Why? The Emperor considered the question. He had been asked many questions across many worlds and many thousands of years of engaging with beings who wanted to understand what he was doing and why. This question, in exactly these 4 letters, he was not certain he had been asked before. Not in this form, not with this much riding on the simplicity of it. "Because that is what the species requires," he said. "Peter, that's not really a why." "Emperor, no." He looked at Peter Parker, who was young in a way that was not just biological. Young in the way of something that has not yet been beaten hard enough to stop believing that the reason it does what it does is the most important thing about doing it. It is not. He looked at the city below them for a moment. "I do not know if I have a better answer than that." Peter nodded. He swung away. The Emperor watched him go until he was a small shape, moving between buildings, and then a smaller shape, and then gone. In Latveria, when the sun had finished setting, Victor Von Doom closed the satellite feed. He had been watching all of it. He had been watching for 3 days with the patience and the attention that were his defining qualities, the things that made him what he was and that he had spent a great deal of his life refusing to find in anyone else. He was quiet for a very long time after the feed went dark. Then he opened a new file on the console to his left. He called it with his own hand from an interface no one else had access to. He began writing in it, in the precise hand of someone who has decided that what he is writing matters enough to write carefully. The file was titled The Alternative. He did not stop writing until dawn. He stood on a roof above Manhattan and watched the sky turn from black to gray, to the specific pale that precedes the color of morning. The stars were in the wrong arrangement. He had noted this on the first night and had filed it with the same neutrality he had applied to everything else. A finding, accurate, significant, requiring no immediate action. The stars above this sky were not the stars above Terra. They were not the stars above any world he had stood on in 38,000 years of standing on worlds. The constellation his eye went to automatically, the one he had used for navigation across a galaxy for longer than most civilizations had existed, was absent from this sky entirely. He had built his Astronomicon to be visible across 60,000 light-years because the galaxy was that large, and his people needed a signal that spanned it. He had no Astronomicon to project here, he had no Primarchs to dispatch. He had no golden throne to sustain him, and no Horus heresy to grieve, at least not yet, at least not in the form he knew. He had a planet of 8 billion people who did not know what they had invited in. He had a psychic landscape saturated with things that required organization. He had the thing he had always had, the certainty that the work was not finished and that no one else was going to do it. For now, that was sufficient. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Strange was making notes. He had been making notes since the night before, and the notes had accumulated into something he was not ready to share, but that he could not stop adding to. He wrote, "The Emperor's arrival had proved that the taxonomy of power in this universe was incomplete, that there were architectures of psychic force operating at a scale this universe had encountered before but had not classified, architectures that did not trace to mutation or to the mystic arts or to divine inheritance, that the universe the Emperor had come from was not an alternate timeline and was not a multiversal variant. It was a genuinely separate cosmological structure, which meant the barriers between it and this universe were structural, which meant they had always existed, which meant something had broken them. The fracture above the North Atlantic had not formed spontaneously. Strange was not able to determine what had formed it, but he was able to determine, with the precision of someone who had spent years studying the nature of dimensional barriers, that spontaneous formation, at that scale, was not consistent with anything in his understanding. He wrote in the margin of the 3rd page, "He is not a threat to this universe. He is a symptom of a threat to both of them. The fracture that brought him here did not form spontaneously. Something, yet far beyond the edge of the local group, in the spaces between cosmic taxonomies, where the entities that embody concepts, rather than bodies, conduct the business of being abstract, something changed, not an intrusion into the multiverse. Those had known signatures, and the instruments that measured them had been calibrated over the age of the universe, and there were none of those instruments that registered anything here. What changed was more fundamental and harder to define. A signal, not from within the multiverse's architecture, but from within it, while also being structured by something outside it. A psychic signal of a type that had no existing classification in any taxonomy the abstract entities maintained. Eternity, in the way that eternity can be said to attend anything, attended to it. It was, in fact, the oldest thing in the available space. If eternity's space could be called a space, and eternity had been in this space since the age of the universe began, the signal did not know it was being noticed. It had never known this across a very long history of being observed by things that had no name in any language it had ever used. He thought about what Sam Wilson had said, not the specific content. He had catalogued the specific content and examined it from every available angle, and had not found the angle at which it resolved. He thought about the form, the question of whether a being could survive differently, whether the method and the survival were separable. He had not in 40,000 years found a method different from his own that worked at the scale he required. He had watched 100 methods fail. He had, in some cases, been the reason they failed, because the method he had chosen required the field to be organized in ways that other methods interfered with, and the species had needed the organizing more than it had needed the alternative. He had decided this. He had decided it alone, as he decided everything, and the decisions had been correct by the only measure he had applied to them. The species had survived. The species was still surviving. The cost of the survival was a number he had long since stopped trying to calculate, not because the calculation was impossible, but because the number was not the point. This universe had beings in it who believed the number was the point. A man who carried a shield because he believed in what shields were for. Not just the physical object, but the idea of a thing that protects without conquering, that holds a line without becoming the thing it holds the line against. A telepath who had built a school on a hill in Westchester because he believed that the gifted and the ungifted could share the same planet without one category consuming the other, and who had spent decades losing and rebuilding, which was a persistence that looked nothing like his own and worked on a scale that was nothing like his own, and was, he found, recognizable. A young man in a mask who swung between buildings because he believed, with the unreasonable confidence of someone who had not yet been broken all the way down, that the size of a responsibility was determined by the size of the power that carried it, and that both were infinite. The Emperor looked at the city below him in the grey light of early morning. He had loved things before and spent them. He had loved humanity and was willing to spend any individual in it. He was looking at a version of humanity he had not been prepared to encounter. And the word for what he was looking at, when it had not yet been decided what it would cost him, was not in any language he had built his policy on. He did not find it. He looked at the city. The city was doing what cities do, people moving through it with the specific purposeful anonymity of beings going somewhere they have already decided to go. A school opening its doors. Somewhere in the distance, a small shape moving between buildings at an altitude that was not consistent with walking, doing something impossible and treating the impossibility as ordinary. Whether the man who had arrived without announcement on the surface of the Atlantic and stood on the water and looked at the lights of this city and said, to no one in particular or to all of them at once, I see you, whether that man would prove to be the best or worst thing this universe had ever inherited, whether the being who had spent 40,000 years building a lighthouse out of a dying body and a species he would not let go would become something this world could stand beside, or something it would eventually have to resist, remained entirely open. Stranger's notes sat unshared on the sanctum desk. Doom's document was still being written in Latveria. Thanos was somewhere outside the system, reassessing. And the Emperor was here watching the city, with nowhere else to be. For now, he was here. For now, the city stood. For now. And look, if that got you going, if you've been sitting there thinking about what universe would actually break first contact with someone like that, drop the character below. Who's the one you want to see land somewhere they have absolutely no business being? Leave the name in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. If you're watching from somewhere outside the usual, tell me where. I want to know where this thing is reaching. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is honestly the time, because the next matchup is going to be one of those, like,